Good morning, Little Masters, and welcome back to today's Tolkien Times, a Prancing Pony podcast production. I'm the Man of the West, and after spending Series 12 looking at artifacts in the Third Age, everything from Sting to Andoril and the Elendilmir and more, I'll be spending this series looking at different cultures of men of the Third Age. Now, if all goes to plan, we'll spend the first several weeks looking at Men of the Darkness, Easterlings, Haradrim, Dunlendings, and more, before learning about the Middlemen, the Men of Dale and of Bree, the Northmen, and of course, the Rohirrim. Now, first, let's be sure to understand the difference between the High Men, Middlemen, and the Men of Darkness. The High Men are perhaps the easiest to explain. Only the Dunedain are High Men, the Men of the West, the descendants of the faithful who escaped the downfall of Numenor. Now, that includes the Dunedain of the South, the Men of Gondor of high lineage, as well as the Rangers of the North. As descendants of the Númenóreans, they are also descendants of the Edain of the First Age. The Middlemen, also known as the Men of Twilight, are those men who were kin to the Edain, but not of the Edain, and therefore not of Númenor. We'll get into a lot more about the Middlemen when we get to them, but we'll have to go back a bit to the Second Age, and maybe even the First, to really understand why and how they differ from the High Men. For now, though, let's move on to the Men of Darkness, because this series will start with the bad guys. And these are the men from the east and south of Middle-earth that originally came under the dominion of Morgoth all the way back in the First Age, or in some cases became dominated by Sauron in the Second Age, worshipping him. But this wasn't a catch-all group. Oh, you're not a High Man or a Middleman, you must be a Man of Darkness. No. As we read in The Peoples of Middle-earth, in Of Dwarves and Men, in the section The Atani and Their Languages, the Men of Darkness was a general term applied to all those who were hostile to the kingdoms, and who were, or appeared in Gondor to be, moved by something more than human greed for conquest and plunder, a fanatical hatred of the High Men and their allies as enemies of their gods. The term took no account of differences of race or culture or language. So it wasn't based on race or language, and it excluded brigands and highwaymen just out to make a buck. These were people who were driven by something or someone more than just greed or conquest. Now, we'll come back to this resource in The Peoples of Middle-earth towards the end of this series to look more at the idea of middlemen. But let's start our studies of the Men of Darkness with the group that I think we might know the least about. In the Battle of the Pelennor Fields, we read this one mention of a group of men. New strength of the enemy came now streaming to the field out of Osgiliath. There they had been mustered for the sack of the city and the rape of Gondor, waiting on the call of their captain. He now was destroyed, but Gothmog, the lieutenant of Morgul, had flung them into the fray. Easterlings with axes, and Veriags of Khand, Southrons and Scarlet, and out of far Harad, black men like half-trolls with white eyes and red tongues. Some now hastened up behind the Rohirrim, others held westward to hold off the forces of Gondor and prevent their joining with Rohan. Now, Easterlings, Southrons, Haradrim, we've heard of them. Veriags of Khand, not so much. In fact, that's literally the only time that Khand is mentioned in the text of The Lord of the Rings. Veriags is seen only once more, when the Knights of Dol Amroth are said to be driving the enemy before them, trollmen and Veriags and orcs that hated the sunlight. So it's not exactly a definitive second mention. Now, we do get a bit more on Khand in Unfinished Tales in the story of Ciriar and Eorl, where we read that after the defeat of the Wain Riders by King Kalimektar and Northmen led by Marhuini in Third Age 1899, the Wain Riders that lived in the east had been spreading southward beyond Mordor and were in conflict with the peoples of Khand and their neighbors further south. We also see on the map of Middle-earth drawn by Christopher Tolkien that Khand lies to the southeast of Mordor, northeast of Nir Harad. In Tolkien's Unfinished Index, we learn of Khand that, somewhat circularly, it is inhabited by Veriags. So it seems that Veriags may simply be the name for the people of Khand. About the only other thing we know about them was that they allied with the Wain Riders in Third Age 1944. The Wainriders had mustered a great host by the southern shores of the inland sea of Rhun, strengthened by men of their kinsfolk in Rhovanion and from their new allies in Khand. This force was the one that fought with and defeated King Ondaher and both his sons, leaving the kingdom of Gondor in disarray before they gave the kingship to Eärnil. Now, one more thing about Variags before we move on. Hammond and Skull point out the Oxford English Dictionary's explanation that Variags is used of the people usually named Varangians, Scandinavian rovers who in the 9th and 10th centuries overran parts of Russia and reached Constantinople. Varangar is Norse for mercenary people, so it is possible that the Variags were simply mercenary types living in Khand rather than all of the people living in Khand. Next week, we'll begin what will likely be a 2-week study of the Easterlings, including the other names for their forces, the Wainriders and the Balchath. In the meantime, folks, thank you for joining me for this week's Third Age Thursday. Be sure to come back tomorrow as we continue the story of Tuor and his coming to Gondolin on First Age Friday. And check out patreon.com/Tolkien Times to learn how you can support the show, get an ad-free feed, join my content council, get a bonus weekly episode, and more. Subscribe to the TTT in your podcast apps or to the PPP channel on YouTube, where the full back catalog of the PPP has now been uploaded for you to enjoy. Be sure you're following @PrancingPonyPod on social media. And finally, as Faramir says, go with the goodwill of all good men.